Hello and welcome back to the Joyful Soul Creates. Charlotte here, and today I'm sharing 10 one-layer cards I made with the Simon Says Stamp April card kit. And in fact, these only use the stamp set from the card kit, which is the Hello Darling stamp set. So if you missed out on the kit itself, then just using the stamp set you can make all of the 10 cards I created here. For the first card, I'm using a pink card base, and I'm going to start by stamping the largest of the plant pots in the stamp set onto that card base, and then arranged 3 plant stems above the pot, and I'm just going to mask off the pot. It probably isn't necessary, but I wanted to make sure the stems weren't going to overlap into it at all. So I used Frosty Pink Altenew ink for stamping the pot, and I'm going to use Coral Berry for all the other elements. So first the stems, and then I swapped to the flower heads and sentiment after taking the stems off, and I stamped them again with the Coral Berry. And then I will add just a touch of white to the open portions in the centers of the flowers using a white gel pen. This just helps brighten those flowers up a bit. And originally I was planning on just leaving it there, but I felt that the card needed something a little bit more. It was a bit too plain. So I put the card base into my paper cutter, and I'm using my score blade to add 3 score lines below the plant pot. And this helps to ground the image as well. And the reason I did 3 is basically the rule of 3s, which is that odd numbers look better. So I spaced them about 1/8 of an inch apart, and that will complete my first card. For my second card, I'm again doing a monochrome card. Wasn't intentional that my first 2 cards were monochrome, but this time I'm using the cream card base, and I'm going to be stamping leafy elements from the kit onto it. So I started with the large Hello Spring leaf sentiment, which I didn't realise until after I'd used it that the letter R is quite unusual looking. It almost looks like an N. You can still tell what it says, but I didn't notice it at all. So I stamped that with the Evergreen ink from Altenew, which is a dark green. Then I'm using the tri-leaf branch and stamping that on 2 edges, and then the single leaf on the other edge. So they make a kind of visual triangle around the sentiment, and I stamped those with Forest Glades ink from Altenew, which is a step lighter than the Evergreen ink. And that completes my second card, which is another very quick one. Card number 3 was a little bit more involved. I'm going to be using a light blue card base this time, and I'm stamping the stripy border stamp with Dusk ink, again an Altenew ink. The inks I used for this card kit were mostly Altenew inks or Simon Says Stamp inks. I do have all the products linked in the description box down below, and also over on my blog if you'd like to see that. Once I'd stamped the border, I'm going to add the bicycle and a sentiment. And I wanted the flowers in the bicycle basket to be colourful, so I inked them up very carefully with the corner of an ink pad. I used Wisteria Simon Says Stamp ink for the flowers, and I used Spring Rain for the leaves. It was a little bit tricky to selectively ink them. You could also mask off the bike. That would probably be easier, but I didn't feel like cutting out a mask, so I just did it with the corner of the ink cube. Then I'm going to use some little bits of post-it tape to mask off the flowers so that I can ink up the rest of the bike. I already stamped the sentiment, and those are both stamped with Versafine Onyx black ink, so a nice rich black. And using the MISTI or another stamp positioning tool for doing this technique with the bike is, I think, very necessary unless you're extremely confident in your lining up, because you want to make sure that each of the colours you use, the stamp still lines up in the correct position. I did have a tiny bit of the bike that didn't quite stamp properly with that black, so I filled it in with a fine liner, and that completes my third card. For card number 4, I'm going to be creating a wreath. I'm again using the 3-leafed branch from the stamp set, and I have placed my blue card base into the Gina wreath builder, and this is the larger template, so I believe it's 4 inches square. And I will stamp each leaf and turn 1 notch and then stamp again, and I'm using Frayed leaf for this stamping, which is even lighter than the Forest Glades ink. And then once I'd finished stamping all the leaves down, I'm going to use the Versafine Onyx Black ink to add my sentiment before going in with some flowers to fill out my wreath a bit more. I did a big flower and a small flower, and I'm using Hollyhock and Wisteria ink for these. All the card bases I have used are A2, so 4 1/4 by 5 1/2, which does mean that the width of the card is slightly more than the width of the wreath builder, which means the wreath is slightly off center, it's more to the left. If you wanted it to be central, you could trim the card base down to be 4 inches rather than 4 1/4, but I thought it didn't really matter that much. Then I further filled in my wreath by adding some little dots using the Frosty Pink Altenew ink. You could use the wreath template again for these, but I decided to just freehand it. I thought it would be easy enough to do, so I'm just using a small acrylic block, which actually is the lid from a ink pad because I don't have any small acrylic blocks, but that's what I use for my small stamps. And that completes card number 4. For card number 5, I'm going to be doing lots of heat embossing. I'm using the chocolate brown card for my card base here, and I'm stamping the large Hello Darling sentiment onto it with my embossing ink, and I have pre-treated the card base with anti-static powder tool. Then I'm going to be stamping a pattern. Again, I'm using the embossing ink, and I'm using a little lid again as my block for this. I first went in and put some of the larger flower heads, and then I'm going to add the leaves. I used the pair of leaves and I've put them kind of next to each of the large flowers, and I enjoy building these kinds of random patterns. A couple of the upcoming cards will also use a similar technique, which you'll see shortly. I find it's easiest to put in the largest images first and then start working your way down to the smallest ones. Sometimes I find I have to go back in again with the larger ones if I realise that I left a big gap, but otherwise I just kind of work at random and try to fill it out until I am happy with it. You do want to make sure you have a very juicy embossing ink for this because you are going to be spending a little while doing your stamping. If you're worried that your ink isn't going to stay wet long enough, and actually I did have some areas I had to go back over after I'd embossed them because they hadn't stuck well enough. But if you are worried about that, you could add your powder after each step and heat set that, and then you don't run the risk of it drying out before you're ready. But you do increase the likelihood that you will warp your card if you have to heat it multiple times, which is why I tried to get all the stamping done in one go so I could heat emboss it in one pass. So I heat embossed it with WOW's Rich Pale Gold embossing powder, and that completes card number 5. Card number 6, I'm again doing some pattern stamping, but this time I'm confining it to a shape. I chose a heart shape, but I've also done this technique with a letter for a monogram, and you could choose any shape as well for this. And as I said, I'm doing pattern stamping again, and I'm using Simon Says stamp inks. So I have Wisteria, Hollyhock, Spring Rain and Melon for this. Again, I started with my largest images, and then I'll work through to smaller ones. As I'm using different colours, I'm trying to pay attention to which elements I put next to each other to try and keep the colours separated so that there aren't two purples right next to each other, for example. And also when I was placing my elements, for example, the first largest flowers, which I did with the purple Wisteria ink, I did them as an odd number because, again, going with the rule of 3 or odd numbers and visual triangles adds interest to the design. So that's what I tried to do. And I will skip ahead a bit, just as this would take forever otherwise to show all this pattern stamping I've been doing. But you can see I filled out starting with the largest images and working my way down to those little tiny dots and fitting them in to fill out the rest of the areas. And I did also take a glitter gel pen and add some extra dots to fill out some more areas and also add a bit of shine to the design. And once I'd finished that, I placed the card base in my MISTI without the mask, and I'm going to stamp my sentiment onto it, again using the Versafine Onyx Black ink, and I've positioned it to the bottom and slightly off to the side of the heart. So that completes card number 6. Card number 7, again I'll be doing some pattern stamping. As I said, I did this a few times. I'm using a pink card base and that Hello Darling large sentiment again. This time I'm stamping it with a navy blue ink. This is a pigment ink. My ink pad was a bit dry, so I had to stamp it multiple times, and I know from experience that this particular ink, again I'll have it linked down below, but this particular ink has a tendency to smudge, so I did heat set it before continuing with my next step because I did not want to get blue smudges all over my card. I'm going to be using the Spring Rain ink again here, and I'm going to be doing pattern stamping, but this time I am only using dots. And this took me quite a long time, so long that my camera died and I didn't catch the end of the footage, but as I've been skipping through it anyway, I don't think that matters too much, so hopefully you'll forgive me for that. I've masked off a segment in the centre just with 2 strips of masking tape, and I have completely filled that out with those dots. And here you can see what it looks like as I peel the tape away, and that completes card number 7. For card number 8, I'm going to go monochromatic. I have a white card base and I'm going to be stamping the bicycle on it with my Onyx black ink. I started by stamping one at the very bottom of the card, and I will shift the card down and I'm going to stamp one at the top. If you watched my 5 cards 1 kit video with the Skull and Crossbones Spring Friends kit, which I'll link in the top right hand corner, the way I'm doing the spacing on these, and in fact the layout I'm using for these, is identical to the card I did for that with the chicks. Basically I'm going to have a gap for my sentiment between my last 2 images, as I did with the chicks on that other card, and that's why I stamped the bottom one first and then the top one and then the second one, rather than working all the way from top to bottom or bottom to top. And I will just add my sentiment into that gap and it fits very nicely, and that will complete card number 8. Card number 9 is very clean and simple and very quick to make. Once I had the stamps arranged, this took me like less than 2 minutes to make this card. So I've taken all of the hearts from the stamp set and I've arranged them in a line stacked up. Working with thirds, I have it kind of shifted towards the right hand third and down towards the bottom of the card, and I'm stamping with Hollyhock ink, which is that nice bright pink. And then I'm going to add my sentiment. I just shifted the card up so that I wouldn't have to take those hearts out of the MISTI yet, so I masked off the bottom of the card so that top heart would not be marking my card when I add my sentiment. You could also, of course, stamp the hearts all the way from top to bottom of the card base by shifting it up like this, but I only wanted the 1 row of hearts, and that will complete card number 9. So that brings us to the final card, and I decided to do something a little bit different. For all these other ones I'd only done stamping, but for this one I thought I would do some ink blending. So I've masked off a wedge of my card with some post-it tape, and I ink blend Wild Honey into the corner, fade out into Squeezed Lemonade and fade that out into white. And I will go back and forwards a little bit just to make sure the blend is exactly how I want it. The idea is that it's darkest in that corner and then fades out to white. And once I am happy with how that looks, I will lift up the masks and then move them around so that I can add my next beam of sunshine. And I will keep repeating this process until I have the beams going all the way around the card. So all the way from the top, or well, the way it's positioned on screen at the moment is the bottom, but it will eventually be the top, and then circling round to the side. Once I had all my beams added, I removed the masks and I'm going to create kind of a circle at that corner as if the actual sun is there so that you can see the sun and not just the sunbeams. And again, I'm using the Wild Honey directly in the corner, moving on to the Squeezed Lemonade and then fading that out to white. Then when I'm completely happy with the ink blending, I'll add the card base into my MISTI, and I'm stamping the Sending Sunshine Your Way sentiment with my Versafine ink. I thought that was just perfect to go with this ink blended sun. And I will finish off by adding some Limoncello Nouveau drops. Some people might argue this makes it no longer a 1-layer card. It depends on your definition because it's not completely flat anymore. But my way of thinking is that as long as you don't use any adhesive on your cards, then they still count as 1 layer cards. At least that's how I look at it. But that completes my 10 cards, and that is all of the cards that I made with this stamp set. I hope you enjoyed them and found them inspiring, and that you will maybe find these techniques useful for making 1 layer cards in future. I would love it if you could leave me a comment and let me know which of them is your favourite. If you're new here and have yet to subscribe to my channel, there is a button on screen you can press, or you can press the red button down below. I will actually be having another video sometime next week showing 10 more cards with this card kit, but those cards will be pattern paper cards, so be sure to check back for those. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you again in the next video. Bye!